psyche itself is the initiator.
Yes.
And through our conversation, I know a dream could be one way that this occurs. Is it the only way, or can these?
No. It can be a serious illness can be another way.
Mm-hmm.
Accidents can be another way. Synchronicities can be another way. And that's where you get the difference between a real synchronicity and what people are calling synchronicities. You know, like, oh, that plane flew overhead just when we were talking about technology, that's a real synchronicity. Well, nothing changes, you know. But a synchronicity is where it hits you right in the guts and you can't go on the same as you could before because you were reached into by the interiority of the world. That's what a synchronicity is. You know, it grabs you by the vitals and you're not the same anymore. And you have to go forward in the darkness knowing you can't go back. That's what a synchronicity is. So that can be the portal, the way in. All of those things, and including, as in my case, it was primarily through the dreams, which had the same punch. They weren't the kind of dream that you could sit back and say, now what does that mean? It's the kind of dream you wake up from in a sweat, in anguish, and it stays with you maybe for a day or two, and you know that it's taking you somewhere and you don't know where you're going to go. That's where dreams become initiatory, and all of that is another word for psyche. The psyche's movement as they punch through into your being.
So just, I mean, if we can possibly simplify it for anyone interested in listening. So the psyche, I guess the collective psyche or objective psyche is initiating one's individual psyche,
Yes. That's an important distinction. Subjective psyche, objective psyche. That's a really important distinction,
mm-hmm.
but they're not separate. They're more like coffee and milk. You know, try to separate coffee and milk, you can't do it. But you know there's milk in the coffee. Like that.
Yeah, could you give us an example of a dream that might be initiatory?
I've recorded a lot in my books and in my essays, and some of them are very long, but let's see. Yeah, here comes one. One I had back in the late 80s, early 90s perhaps, was where the dream began, where I was in a cave and it was dark, damp, and this blue light, almost at the ultraviolet end, but I could still see its blueness, was pervading the cave. And I was dressed in a white coat. And in this middle of the cave was this slab of stone. Cold slab of stone. Everything, the mood was cold, damp, dark. Or you could almost think underground. And on top of this slab of stone lay a figure, a prone woman on her back, seemingly dead, and naked to the waist down, white. And about at her waist there was a sheet going further down, covering the bottom half, but it was soaked in blood. And I looked at this dreadful scene, and a voice of authority said, "You must heal her." I had no idea what on earth that voice was talking about. How could I possibly heal her? In fact, I came up with the conclusion, I can't possibly heal her. But what awoke in my heart was a desire to heal her, so I had both. A desire to do something. But with the knowledge that I didn't know the first step, what to do. So the dream became initiatory because I carried that feeling of not knowing what to do and yet really desiring to do something into waking life. And what's the consequence of that? Well, the consequence is I began to suffer. And that is the healing balm, the suffering. That's the piece that you could never get through the intellect. It reminds me of a poem where I just remember it vaguely at the moment, but it's the same idea where the poet's writing about a woman in the ear dancing and singing, but I ignored her and went about my business, and she began to wilt and die, and her wings fell off. And then I noticed that, and I began to wail and suffer, and then her wings grew back on, and she gained. It's the same idea. Because when we negate suffering as an aspect of human life, our soul being suffers. That was the figure on the slide. Terrible. She suffers. If we enter the world of suffering and love, desire, she starts to celebrate. She starts to come to life. That's the dream logic. That's the soul phenomenological logic, and that's where dreams can be initiatory because they bring fresh meaning and new logic, a new way to think about life, and that gradually precipitates down to a new way of perceiving life. That's the initiation. So that dream, along with many others, was initiatory in that way.
And so who was she in the dream? Like who was she representing in the psyche? And
the woman who taught me love, the figure that taught me love, love for the soul, that I did love the soul. I never knew that. And that when the soul suffers, that's my suffering in the soul. The soul can suffer. And when I began to experience that suffering, that became the healing of soul. Yeah, this is soul logic. Mm-hmm. And you can only get it by being initiated into it. And that's by absolutely taking the dream just as being just so. And if you work really hard to transform the imagery of the dream into its own logic, thought, its own thinking. Once you get that, then you've got fresh meaning and you proceed in a totally different way. When you have the meaning of the dream is not external, not through an external interpretation, that's something else. The meaning in the dream is implicit in the imagery. It's your job, or my job, to gradually, it takes time, to think the thought of the dream, and then you've integrated, and there's no difference then between my suffering and her suffering. And that's what heals the soul. The soul is harmed by the dissociation between me and everything else. So the logic of the dream heals that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not meant to be easy. I mean,
sure.
Because look, people. I'll give you one of my favourite analogies. We all have a brain, right? But nobody thinks for a moment that just because I've got a brain, I'm an expert on the brain. But we've all got a psyche, right? We all dream. Everybody thinks they're an expert on their dream and their psyche. They don't think any specialised training is necessary. So people come with their dreams and they're the immediate authority, and if you challenge that authority through having a different perspective, they'll bat you away. That's what's happening today. So just by the sheer virtue of having a psyche or having dreams, we think, oh, I'm the authority, I know everything there is to know. And so the dream just becomes a reflection of what they already know. We do that. That's the prejudice we have today. Nobody thinks that maybe 10, 20 years have to be spent learning how to think soul phenomenologically, but you do. But Jung was very big on this, very big on this. If you think you can come to dream work naively, like opening up a brain and having a look and saying, well, I can take that tumor out. No. It truly is, it's a discipline. Soul phenomenology is a discipline you take on. And I think you have to be called to do so. You take it on. And you study and you work it, and you're working at the level of thinking, because our thinking at the moment is producing the dissociated world, the subject against everything else, which is not subjective. That's the split we have today. This is written about a lot. But how does one heal that? Well, you have to heal that through a different kind of logic. Well, how do you get to the different kind of logic? Through initiation. And dreams have that logic. They think that way. So thinking the thought of the dream is initiatory. You start to think dialectically. And the dissociation between subject and object disappears. So when I suffered, like in the beginning it was just me being, I can fix you, or maybe I think I can fix you, and she's suffering. That's daytime logic. But when I began to suffer, I began to think a different kind of logic. She is me, I am her, she is not me, but all we are at the same time. She is me and not me at the same time. That's the logic. And that has to become an experience.
It's
not meant to be easy.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm reminded, and I know I would like to touch on how one goes about this and how you've gone about it, and we'll have lots of little conversations around this in throughout these discussions. But right now, I'm remembering a dream I had a week ago, where in the dream, without going into all the details, I had my own personal idea of what it meant or something. I'm trying to remember now, but like the distinction between one's personal subjective ideas about how okay, let's go back to the dream. What was it?